welcome everybody to our final session of today. This is the 12th International Dementia Conference, and this session is on psychosocial interventions. So it's called What Works and For Whom? We have three speakers, Professor Esme Moniz-Cook, Catherine Daly, and Francis Maloney. I'm Sinead Brennan, and I'm CEO of Engaging Dementia. I am stepping aside this week, and Kim Tully is going to be taking my place. Kim is co-hosting the conference, and I'll be doing a Master's in Psychology, so I'll be stepping over later this week. And you will see Kim, if you haven't seen her already, during the conference tomorrow. So I'd encourage the attendees to submit some comments or questions through Q&A. And if you use Twitter, we're at EngagingDemIRL, hashtag DementiaConf20. So there you go. I will start with introducing Professor Esme Moniz-Cook. So so Esme is the, I'll get your full title here, Esme. The Professor of Clinical Psychology of Aging and Dementia Care at the University of Hull. And Esme will be talking about psychosocial interventions, what works and for whom.
Thank you, Sinead. And thank you, Grace and Engaging Dementia, for inviting me to do this final roundup talk, I think, of what has been a really impressive 2 days of fact-filled innovation and time to think and celebrate some of the wonderful things that have been going on in dementia care. I have listened to one or two things, and I certainly know the last symposium, I was feeling very homesick, having been brought up in Kenya, speaking several African languages, and including Swahili, but also watching somebody from Brazil, given that my ethnic background made me try and learn a bit of Portuguese at one time. So it's been a worldwide wonderful engagement, and thank you again. What I'm going to do is, for those, this is a year ago I came across and talked to people with in Ireland. The slides might look similar, they're not that similar, because I want to spend some time thinking about some of the challenges that we need to be thinking about in research and practice. So the sort of work we do, I do, is much more research into practice. How do we overcome some of the obstacles of getting what we know into practice, and also learning more from people with dementia and families of what they need and don't need. So in the past, and this is when I first started it, the aims of psychosocial intervention in past decades were really to act as in the early stages to reduce the risk of disability later. So it was about getting a sort of suppressant effect. And they always involved the person and, in inverted commas, the carer in the early stages, family members or people in the social environment. Later on, obviously, if they're carers and care homes, it would need to involve them too. These early interventions were sort of prophylactic. People may not have been kind of talking about their concerns really, because they didn't have any. They were just hearing about a diagnosis. And you know, there are many, many reviews. You've seen some in the earlier symposium of community-based psychosocial interventions. I'm going to leave aside institutions and care homes, because my brief is to think about the communities. And there you can see there's some from Ireland. Fiona's done one, and of course, one from my own team here. So these reviews have been based on what really are what they call randomized controlled trials. Now, I think many of you have heard how my views about these randomized controlled trials. One of the biggest problems we have is to do these like they do with the drug industry, these large scale trials. We've got to find huge numbers, like often 400 to 500 participants. These are people with dementias. They've got to agree to join the trial. Then you've got to divide them up between a placebo group and another group. And often the people in the placebo group may or may not be getting something or what we call usual care. And none of us know what usual care is because it depends on what's going on in people's communities. They also tend to give us averages. So it's still tough to find out what works for the individual person sitting in front of us or within our families, and for us as family caregivers. So what we do know from those old studies is that they always started with the family caregiver interventions, and you have to walk. They used to involve both the person and the carer, but the focus was very much on the caregiver personal needs. If you're trying to do work, a lot of this work that I'm going to be talking about in some of the slides that I've used comes from a group that we set up in Hull in 1999, the Interdem collaboration for research into practice. And many of you in Ireland, I know, are working in academia, are involved in large-scale studies now, including in our academy, Interdem Academy. The current chair is Mira Vernoy, and we've been writing a lot about some of the newer ways of thinking about people with dementia, which does take sort of active involvement of people and their families. And I want to kind of remind us the other underlying thing that makes for good is to have some sort of coordination, some sort of way of walking with families, and that people and their families through their journey with the disability, many of who have other disabilities and other health conditions, multimorbid heart disease and various other diabetes and other things that need to be managed. Sadly, that care coordination is not that strong anymore, certainly in this country. People tend to get diagnosis and get moved on and signposted back to their GPs and to Alzheimer cafes, etc. But that underlying care coordination remains something that is important. Now, I just want to kind of think back to some studies locally. So on the left, we did 2 primary care-based studies. One was very old, and wasn't a randomized trial, but what we did is spent time talking with people and their families just at the time of diagnosis. We then divided them up. One group went to a very good quality community mental health team supported by a nurse. The other group stayed just and had some practitioner-led sessions. And what we found there was that it reduced family burden over a year. So we then went on to do a randomized trial. And while we saw cognition in both groups worsening over 12 months, mood and what we call challenging behavior, which I don't ascribe to as a term anymore, actually got worse compared to that experimental group over 12 months. And that's fairly early on. People had a lot of, well, still in the mild dementia stages. And what we also saw as mood and challenging behavior got worse in the community mental health team group, where they were being followed up in some cases, psychotropic drugs also increased. So on the right, we've got the CMHT group. And what we did there is we trained a key community mental health nurse, and these days you can call them admiral nurses or specialist nurses in dementia care. And what we did was not just train them, but also it was a problem-solving approach that some of you talk about, as a previous speaker spoke about in care homes. But what we did do, that nurse had access to a sort of PSI specialist, and sometimes we knew when to go to the psychiatrist or the geriatrician. And we saw in that study, again, carer mood and behavior. Behavior problems went down, carer mood was doing well, compared to other people who were supported in that same CMHT. But what was particularly interesting was, and we all know that family carers are also at risk, especially if they're older. So that survival curve, which is those little graph at the bottom there, in the green and the blue, what it just tells us is that over a 10-year period, some of which is how we had to work it because of the large numbers, the family carers were who had some support and case management with supervision. The nurse had some supervision. She was specialist dementia care nurse, but had he or she, and they had some access to kind of reflecting and problem solving. And the family carers lived longer if they were older compared to sort of aged over 70 family carers. So we separated out the kind of younger caregivers to the sort of spouses quite often. So, you know, what it's showing us is not just about living and managing problems, but it can moderate family caregiver stress. Can we have the next slides, please? And here we have a review. Some of you will have heard about these Cochrane reviews. So this is a kind of behavior concerns or behavior management review that we did in 2012, of which on the right there, you'll see that very same study, that training study, which produced the good results. That was the kind of only one. From the rest of the studies at the time were all not in North America and Australia. There were only 2 care home studies. Since then, obviously, you've heard Clive Ballard speak earlier today, I hope. And our WELD study has actually also shown some good results in terms of behavior management and indeed quality of life in care homes. You can have the next slide. What we then went on to do is we got a grant from the NIHR, a $2 million grant, and what we wanted to do is try and upscale some of this work. Have we got the timely intervention slide up? No, one before. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we wanted to really get some of this work out to community mental health teams, real study is real world work in the whole of the country. So we recruited 33 teams across the whole of England and in NHS services, huge teams. And we asked them to kind of look out for families who are reporting problems, behavior problems of some sort. And they went through every single case referred for dementia. This was 6,000 referrals over 6-point-something months, and told us that they couldn't find anybody. What we discovered was happening was they were actually missing. If people had mild dementia and they had no way of telling what the real problems were for families, they kind of tended to miss the problems, and they would send people off to memory clinics for diagnosis, and then the person would go back to the GP and be lost till serious problems happened later. And a lot of their work was being done in care homes when the majority of people were actually living in their own home. As we know, more people live in their own home than live in care homes if they have a dementia. So if we go on to the next slide, what we then found out with the people we did manage to find, so I think there was some kind of 157 people over six months. We used a checklist called the Revised Behavior Problem Checklist by Linda Terry. And here we have some of the commonest problems. And what was happening was, if you have 5 problems on that checklist, you are actually clinically significant. You've got clinically significant problems, but if people were missing that, and of course then families thought, well, this is what dementia is, we can't do anything about it. So what we've been doing now is really asking people to fill that, get family carers to fill that in. And if they've got 4 or 5, they deserve good quality specialist care to help them work with their relative or others to try and improve some of these problems. So things like asking the same question, number 3 there, 89% of them, nearly 90, is a really, really, if it continues all day, can be quite stressful. And yet there are ways of actually managing that and reducing some of the family caregiver stresses. Interestingly, we've got a sister version of that called the Challenging Behavior Scale, which I devised is used very widely now in care homes and institutional settings. And again, it's based on the day-to-day problems that staff caregivers are finding difficult to manage. So that is very widely used. And again, there we find if people have up to 4 behaviors on that, people with dementia, they are clinically significant and problems. And somebody spoke earlier about how 4 or 5 problems were really making, a lot of people had 4 or 5 problems that each need to be dealt with by the families or by the carers in care homes. So we're beginning to learn to help practitioners and even families themselves detect when they do have problems that can be actually moderated and made less problematic, if we even knew that they actually existed. And often that was the problem. People just didn't know what the problems were because they weren't checking systematically. So if we move on to the next slide. This was the program, and we've now developed an interactive online training course that in yellow is the actual link to it. And this is really a systematic way of, rather than just problem solving, of asking the right sort of questions so that people can, whether they're dealing with people mainly in care homes or even in their own homes, can begin to understand the health needs, the psychological needs of the person, but more important, the needs of the system underneath them. So for example, a family caregiver would have their own stress needs and might need counseling over and above teaching the person how to use strategies to manage some of these so-called behavioral concerns that exist. And, you know, we do talk about these behavioral concerns, but these are very often a result of a misunderstanding of what the need is in the person, whether it's needs for reassurance, needs for feeling safe, needs when people sometimes are looking for their mother, they're looking for comfort. So it's about learning to kind of not lie, but learning how to kind of find out what the psychological and emotional needs are in the person who is showing these so-called difficult behaviors. So if we move to the video now, I'll give you an example of George and Mary.
Mary! Mary!
What is it, George? I'm trying to get everything ready for dinner.
Where are the children? Where are they?
I told you 100 times. Jim is in America and Barry's in Spain at the moment. You know that.
Where are they?
I've just told you. Jim is in America and Barry's in Spain. Now I must get on.
Where are they? I can't see them. Where are they, Mary?
George, just sit there and read your paper. Dinner will never be ready at this
They'll
time.
be expecting me.
So in the next slide, you will see that through some systematic questions, you can work out how, what might be going on. For example, his hearing might have not been that good from certainly checking out on whether you even had his hearing aids or not. The care approach will be very much about the psychological needs of George. In this case, it turned out that he was a headmaster, so Life Story told us something, and it was lunchtime and he thought he was in the playground and he needed to sort the children out ready for school. So, teaching Mary to kind of learn to ask different questions helped there. And then she was very stressed. And so the caregiver and care environment needed much more support. Otherwise, she would have given up on care by this stage. So you need to kind of think about the health, the psychosocial needs, support plan, and also the system underneath that. And I see time is going on. So if we can move to the next slide, and I'll just may have to run through. So we moved on to thinking that psychosocial interventions are now not just about suppressing behavior, but we want positive interventions to improve relationships and a sense of control. People want valued, meaningful activity. They want to be socially integrated. And this involves both people again and their families. So in the next slide, we can have a look at some of I want to just pick two studies. The first one was a reminiscence study. It was a group one called RemCare, and the other one comes from the CST group, but this is individual cognitive stimulation. Now you'll have heard a lot about these two, but what I want to touch on here is the results that we've had to publish. The reminiscence group, people enjoyed wonderfully. They came in couples and they acted out fun times, whereas the ICST, we were translating the group CST that you've heard of from the Spectre Labs into much more an individual home-based one, because not everybody wants to go to groups. So if we go on to the next slide, you see here for reminiscence, there they were, people are now acting out their marriage and having dances. But what we found was that family members became more anxious over time, and there were no effects on quality of life. And what was basically happening, the family caregivers were seeing their partners, husbands and wives, or mums and dads, acting very normally in these group sessions, and then going home and getting these repeated questions. And in psychology, we call it cognitive dissonance, which just shut up their anxiety over time. But again, we were taking them measurements well after the actual sessions, and yet the joy that you saw within sessions, which many of us see, was completely missed. If you have the next slide. And the same with cognitive stimulation at home. In the old CST world, the group work did show some effect on cognition being maintained and quality of life outcomes. Here we saw nothing, but we did see a better improvement and maintenance and a good quality relationship with the person and their family caregiver. So in the next slide, we go back to where we all started. Next slide, please. And it reminds you of the father of some of this work, that Tom Kitwood, who reminded us that really what is meaningful is how we can interact with other people, and that we're essentially social beings. And, sometimes we can spend a lot of time trying to mend cognition or mend dementia, rather than trying to improve the social health and the social world of people with dementia and those that they interact with. It reminds me of, we can go to the next slide. A report that shocked me, a world report showing that stigma in 2019 is as bad as ever when it's attached to dementia. Not so with stroke and other conditions, but dementia still holds that huge stigma. Nobody actually believes that you can do much for people with dementia. This was shocking. Tom Kitwood was a social psychologist who tried to remind us that the social environment can make or break people. And just listening to a poignant talk in one of the sessions earlier on, people were talking about, the person was talking a little bit about the home-based work that people were doing that has been completely undermined by the medicalization attached to COVID, which has stopped us being able to interact in any way, meaningful way with people with dementia. So if we go on to the next slide, and I would certainly advise you to have a look at this stigma report, because it was pre-COVID and worldwide and quite surprising. If we move on next, so what we need to do is start combating it. And in the next slide, it reminds me, you know, when we go to diagnosis, at the moment, not many people are turning up at memory clinics for diagnosis probably, but we found we had to change the environment and tackle the the medicalization of our hospital clinics or day centers or whatever else, by just making it much more an open access, homely place where people with dementia could meet others at the time of diagnosis and start combating, if we go on to the next stage, the notion of prescribed disengagement, which is something that, so we need to kind of try and start separating out what is brain from our human being. I'm just calling it mind, and explaining symptoms. And in the next slide, there's an example of how you can do that for individuals. And that was a group session as well, to explain to people that, you know, there is a difference with who they are and what their brain happens to do or not do. So let's move on to the next slide. And then we've got so many choices. Here's our first Interdem book, and there's a list of huge number of choices. And how do we know what to choose? You know, we ask people, they may want, they may not want, and we just never really know. So if we can move on to the next slide. So we started thinking a little bit about how you can target support and actually in a timely way right at the start of the journey, possibly at diagnosis. And what we've produced in the chapter 2 of this book that came out earlier this year, go on to the next slide, is a sort of, again, a systematic, what we call case formulation, but a way of actually knowing how much time we've got to spend with people doing to try and get them to engage with society and life and what their needs are. And if you notice there's both the person and the caregiver needs. The family need profile is what we've got, and the case examples and ideas about what on that list might suit certain people, but where you really need to pay attention, especially if a family caregiver seems very confident, but is actually quite upset underneath it all. And these days we call it social capital as well, how much of the person with dementia, how much social capital they have themselves. So let's move, there are just 8 profiles, so it's actually not rocket science, but it's about targeting things in fairly early on, and then keeping an eye out on those who are going to need much more support than others. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And you know, one of our biggest problems with all of this research is that, what do we measure? So in these studies, you know, people will only pay for things if they think that, so CST's in this country very popular because it's got the evidence base. But one of the big problems is how do we measure all of this? You know, who takes part? We don't know who refuses to take part in some of these studies, but a lot of people don't. We have the here and now effects versus, you know, going and checking out a few months later. And that makes for problems in measurement. But one of the ones that is particularly difficult is this whole notion of what is quality of life versus well-being. And in our next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the deficit needs-based model versus a strengths asset-based model that I think we need to now embrace. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So in the moment measurement has come out very much as something that we started with Alzheimer's Europe, who involved people with dementia in their research. That's the first paper. And then through a JP&D project, we tried to capture some of these meaningful outcomes. And the big thing that came out for people was that people with dementia is that, you know, the moments of joy are actually more important than whether we go and measure quality of life 6 months later and discover or not discover what's going on. And I think that's the difference between some of the early work that probably fitted in closer with the biomedical model, where we gave people an intervention and then looked for change, I don't know, 6 weeks later. And there's a thing called experience sampling method that's coming out for people with dementia and family carers from the Netherlands, where you can actually now use staff boards to actually find out what the in the moment measures are, how much they're enjoying life or not, which may be a way of persuading our funders to start looking at more meaningful ways of understanding well-being in people with dementia. Can we have the next slide, please? So we need to move from this deficit, including our own work and InterDem, but also people who have written a little bit about models on Kitwood's dementia needs model for well-being, and move to the idea of understanding well-being in people with dementia. We did, on the right there is a paper that came out that I hope people will start using, that came out earlier this year that our group did, about looking at how we can go about measuring well-being. And what we found in that work is there are actually 35 instruments that have been self-report instruments that have been used with people from early to moderate dementia. And these instruments cover things like joy and spirituality and all sorts of wonderful things. And it made me think of how reviewers in the past have not accepted papers where people seem to feel they've transcended their dementia and they're actually beginning to have a good life despite it all. It just didn't fit with this model of deterioration that some people kind of hold close to their hearts because the brain happens to deteriorate over time. So in the next slide, we've got what we think is the difference between quality of life, which is more a traditional view where well-being is just seen as one aspect of it, an alternative view where quality of life is a dimension of one of the aspects of well-being, the emotional aspect, but there are other paths to well-being. So if we move on to the next slide. Here we have now all the kind of work on the positive psychology and well-being with dementia, and there's plenty of it coming out, including measurement. And if we move on to the next slide, please. And in that study that we've just finished, we found conceptually there were instruments that can measure emotional well-being with people, social well-being, which is about psychological well-being. And interestingly, there's a lot of work on psychological well-being, less so on emotional and particularly social well-being. And all of that can come into what is a satisfying life well lived for the person with dementia. So what we want to see is more of these instruments used. We may be able to do observational work with videos for people who cannot fill in self-report, but we really need to start looking for some of the experiences that people with dementia, with the help of their caregivers, because without them, all of us, people are not given the respect and we haven't given them the standing so that they can't then engage with us in social life. So I would urge people to start thinking all these wonderful singing groups, dance groups, and the rest of things that creative interventions, to start beginning to evaluate them. Sadly, you see studies, there's a big JPND study starting with a horizon across Australia and Europe, and they're evaluating singing or music. But sadly, quality of life is the measurement. And my sadness is that quality of life measured, I don't know, 6 months later to find out did it make any difference or not, may again produce the sort of results that suggest that it's either not effective or not cost effective. And there are many very large studies that have been carried out recently that have been depressingly not shown against a control group that they're doing any good. And my argument is that we may just be measuring the wrong thing at the wrong time. And the final slide, I hope. Can we move on? So our emerging approaches are the whole notion of social health. We edited a journal, Mira and myself, in 2018, and really beginning to start thinking about this whole issue of how ingrained social stigma is, the whole issue of social life in dementia, and that the fact that people can actually engage in meaningful things probably to the end of their life. And one of the papers in this social health special issue was from a student of ours in Hull who showed how people with dementia very early on post-diagnosis felt they'd already become the other ring. They were not people in their own right, which fitted very much into the kind of social disengagement and that Kate Schwaffer talks about in Australia. Integration, we need to kind of begin to think, we're very good at thinking about cognitive biomarkers, but I think, we ought, never mind cognitive, but social markers exist. There's the digital age, which is growing, and here we are. Yesterday we all did exercise and dance classes, not exercise, dance classes on Zoom. And I have to say, with these creative arts approaches that are coming along, which we'll move on to next, we really need to beginning to look at asset-based outcome measures and convincing people, our funders, that psychosocial interventions are not pills to be handed out. They take subtlety, but they can be systematic if we start properly and understand the interpersonal world of the person and the communities that they live in. So, so we can move on. Next slide. It's the final slide. So I just wanted to remind people that it's the feel-good factor that we're pushing. And remember the brain. I've used lots of pictures because we know that the creative arts, the amygdala's there, the hippocampus can do what it's doing in dementia, but the emotion and the amygdala continues on. And the more we can actually draw on that, both with visual representation, emotion, and some of the creative arts, music, choirs, dance, nature, country walking, and we heard about vegetable growing and people being invited into a home to join in from the communities earlier on. So if we can go on, and my challenge, I suppose, is in the final slide. I think it is the final slide now. Is that I can't leave you without Mira's slide, that we will have plenty of colorful shoes to choose from. People have them. So let us go and enjoy doing proper research and proper interventions that help connect people with others to bring joy in the moment. And let us take on a new way of doing both research and also reminding ourselves that psychosocial interventions, however manualized they are not pills in their own right. They are better ways to start finding out how all of us can use what we've learned. And that would be including the times and the COVID era that we've learned, but certainly the post-COVID, because our challenge is going to be to counteract some of the negative views that people have built up over this time. And hopefully we will begin to at least attack that in care homes. Certainly I've heard that in our country just recently today, a judge has said that care homes cannot stop relatives visiting their own relatives and homes. And I think the human rights agenda will start bringing on some of the good work that we've been campaigning for many years in dementia care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esme, for that absolutely fascinating talk and that passionate call to action as well. And it's been a long time coming, but it is great that outcome measures people are starting to really look at this. Just to comment in passing, Charlotte Stoner actually gave a presentation yesterday of a new positive psychology outcome measure. So if anyone tuning in here would be interested in seeing that, it'll be available on our channel at a later date. Now I will introduce Catherine Daly. So Catherine is a senior occupational therapist, and Catherine, who is speaking about matching occupational identity to opportunities in the community. Thank you, Catherine.
So hopefully everyone can see that screen there, and thank you, Sinead, for asking me to talk this afternoon. So what I'm going to do is have a look at matching occupational identity to opportunities in the community. What I'm going to do within the next sort of 15 minutes or so is have a look at occupational identity, how that gets expressed, how we can support people with dementia's occupational identity, and then how we try and match that with opportunities that are in the community. So here's a lovely, very wordy definition of what occupational identity is. And it's probably one of the reasons why as occupational therapists, sometimes, certainly I know when we were first starting out, it was quite difficult to explain what it was that we were looking at for people and to describe what it is exactly that we did. So it's a composite sense of one who is and wishes to become as an occupational being generated from one's history of occupational participation. So volition, habituation, and experience, very important in it. But actually, if we try and sort of translate that a little bit into more accessible terms, what you'll find is that actually occupations are the ordinary everyday things that we have to do every day and that we choose to do. And that actually our occupational identity is akin to sort of what's making us tick and how that gets expressed and experienced then within our lives. And so when we talk about, in the model of human occupation, we talk about volition, habituation, and experience. And I remember it so clearly from, I mean, it's 20 years on now, but what our lecturers would have talked about was essentially what we're talking about is the will, the drill, and the skill. So essentially the will, so the reason why somebody does an occupation. So that's got to do with their personal causation, their values, and their interests. And then there's the drill. So that's these regular roles, habits, routines. They're the sort of fabric and structure within which we live. So our roles, if I'm a role as a mother, all of a sudden there's a lot of activities that would come with that. Our routines are structured. And then in addition, we also have the skill. So the actual ability to perform that particular occupation, and also the lived experience, how it feels to do that. And of course, those three things don't happen in isolation. They happen within an environment, and they also happen through a sort of feedback loop. So I remember as a child, I was looking for a guitar for Christmas, and God bless my parents, they went and got it for me. And for some reason, obviously it was an interest at the time, but I think I didn't have to go through the drill bit and that I'd automatically be brilliant at playing the guitar, which I clearly wasn't. So as a result, the skilled action wasn't there. And actually my lived experience was that I just didn't really have much interest in it in the end. And so that feedback loop means that now I'm not a guitar player at all, which is a relief, I'm sure, to many people in my life. But if we think about, I suppose, trying to again simplify what occupational identity is, oftentimes if we think about adding ing onto our own name, this is sort of an easy way of thinking about what it is. So if I am Catherineing, well then what am I likely to be doing? And equally, if I am Esmeing or Sineading or Francising or anyone who's listening to this presentation, if I'm adding ing onto the end of my name, then what are the kinds of things that would come up? So for me, this is just some of them. So if we pull out a few bits, I suppose in this slide, there are a number of things that are my roles. So as a daughter, mother, wife, sister, neighbor. And then there's other things that I really enjoy doing, like upcycling, napping. I can nap at the drop of a hat, which is a great skill to have. And then there's other things, because of course occupations aren't always things that we love to do, you know, that are big leisure activities. Sometimes when I look at running, I suppose if I had done this, there's a temporal aspect to occupation, because if I had done this like in March and April, running wouldn't have been there, because I think, like many of us, I sort of during the initial lockdown just kind of ate my way through it. And so as a result, now this time around, running is part of it. Because, and when we think about what Sean and Kathy were talking about yesterday in terms of cognitive reserve and building that up, it's really important, that level of exercise in your life. So running, or I should really probably say shuffling, from my perspective, is in there, not because I absolutely love it, but because in the grand scheme of things, I actually think it's probably a useful, good thing for me to be doing. And it's interesting because that I know is new enough, and it hasn't fully, I haven't fully identified with it in terms of my occupational identity. So I'm cautious when I say running. I talk about shuffling. I wouldn't describe myself as a runner. And yet, when I'm out, and if I'm kind of shuffling past somebody who I consider to be a proper runner, and then they sort of give me the nod, I think there must be a runner's nod because I've gotten it once or twice. And then all of a sudden that starts to then impact on my view of myself and this occupation. So actually, maybe I could become a runner. So my occupational identity is very rich, and it's made up of lots of things, as are everyone who's sitting and watching this. So are yours when you think about all the different things. And when you think about even one role, so you think about the role of a mother, if that's on your list, and then you think about all the activities that fall out from that. So everything from uniforms to lunchboxes to playing to guiding. So occupational identity is complex. And I really wanted, I suppose, instead of trying to find, and a little bit like looking at that picture of all of those shoes, instead of trying to say, oh, well, if this happens, then this is the good match for it. I kind of wanted us to have the opportunity to just really think about this year, because I think collectively we've all gone through this experience where our own occupational identity has been threatened. And of course, we know when somebody has a diagnosis of dementia, their occupational identity can have some restrictions put on it, either by their ability to perform that occupation that they've always enjoyed, or because maybe now they're not welcome at that activity that they've always enjoyed. Where it's more difficult to get there or involve themselves in it. So I wanted us to just think a little bit more in terms of occupational identity, and think back to sort of March and April, when really the ordinary everyday things that we did changed, and actually collectively how challenged we were by that. So think about things like how your roles changed. So those sort of everyday roles that we were doing. Sometimes for some of us within our work role, we may have been redeployed. Many of us were trying to skill up and watching PPE videos. Most of us were trying to figure out how to use this kind of technology so that we could still provide some kind of a service to people. So in a time that was very uncertain, our roles, which sometimes can be our anchor, they're the thing, oh, I know what I'm doing when I go into work, or at least I hope I do. All of a sudden, this then became more challenging, because now I'm having to really, it's not so much of an anchor anymore, because I do know what I'm doing, but I'm having to do it in a completely different way. If we think about the activities that we choose to do that we could no longer doing. So, you know, if you were someone who always got your hair blown around on a Thursday, and that was something you couldn't do, or if you were a golfer, now you couldn't do that, or you like to play tennis and now you couldn't do it. And you think about the impact that that actually had on many of us individually, that those activities that gave us such a sense of well-being, we weren't able to do anymore. And I think, again, in terms of thinking about it for ourselves, but then also thinking about it in terms of somebody with dementia, what it is like for them, we now sort of have at least a semblance of an experience of what it's like to not be able to have access to the activities that we like to do. So think about how not doing those then made us feel. And we have seen that a lot in terms of our occupational identity. You'd hear this time around when the restrictions were coming in, that there was a lot of debate in the news about, well, if the GAA is going ahead, then how come my dance class can't go ahead? Or I'm a golfer, how come I can't go and play golf, but that person can go to training? Or I really want to play tennis. And what was interesting in all of those conversations was actually how unique we all are, but also each person was expressing this is the occupation that is of huge value to me, and it's part of my occupational identity, and it's now being restricted. And so it was the thing that was most important to them that they were talking about. So we think about our daily routine changes and our weekly routine changes. So again, there's something we find a lot when we're working in the community with somebody who has a diagnosis of dementia. You know, you're trying to keep that daily routine as routine as possible to keep people within the parameters of a structure that can help them to continue to function. But you're also looking at, like, oftentimes it might only take one or two things in the week that helps sort of anchor that week for somebody, because if I'm doing something on a Friday, then kind of Thursday I'm thinking about getting ready for it, Friday I'm doing it, Saturday I'm enjoying the fact that I did it, and then oh, I have another thing coming up on Tuesday. And so sometimes our daily and our weekly routines can fall out of just one or two things that have the structure. Think also about how much and how quickly we had to adapt, and we are still adapting, and the level of resilience that it has required. And then think about getting a diagnosis where you have to constantly adapt, because that's part of it. And as a care partner also to somebody who has dementia, they also have to adapt. And then think about how our new normal kept changing, and how each time we had to adapt to it. You know, the first time we put a mask on, we went into the shop, and just how strange that felt. Whereas now it actually feels quite, well, normal as it is within the current environment. So the new normal keeps changing. And again, we know that for people with dementia with a diagnosis, they can figure things out. Maybe that's, no, I have the medication figured out, and then maybe something changes. And now actually that occupation is difficult. So just keep an eye on time. So think about any of the additional roles that you had to take on. So I started shopping for my parents, which is something I would never normally do. They're very active and independent. And it was strangely intimate that's the only way I can describe it, to get a sort of a shopping list from my mum. It's just sort of the salmon that your father likes, and, you know, these types of eggs. It just all seemed very strange. And it was this additional role that I was taking on in addition to, you know, the other roles that were already there. So oftentimes we can take on additional roles. And then if you think about that sort of lack of respite from family life, so from a lot of us, certainly those of us who were parenting, all of a sudden the children were at home, our partners might have been at home, some people might have been working from home, and then all of a sudden there just wasn't that space. And that was happening in a time when our usual occupations that help us reduce stress weren't available to us. So why do we reflect on all of that? I suppose it's just to really bring it home. That experience that we've all had was a threat. That was essentially restrictions on our occupational identity and what it feels like to be us and how we tick in our normal, usual way. And of course, this can happen for people with dementia. And that's why it's really important that in everything that we do, we're trying to support people to continue to feel like themselves. So a nice way to think about it, and it's been talked about in some of the literature, is that our occupations, we know they're really important, and actually they can be described as the fabric of our well-being. So if we think about our well-being, how we feel about our day, how we feel about ourselves, and then if we look at the sort of the weaves, those different threads being weaved in and out to make this wonderfully rich, colourful, fabulous fabric. And we think, well, actually all those occupations are the small, or all those threads are the small occupations that we have to do and that we choose to do every day. And in the end, we get this sort of rich level of well-being. So we weave our fabric, and our well-being is weaved. But, and here's what's happened to many of us this year, and here's what happens, or can happen for people with dementia, is that actually some of that becomes unraveled, some of those occupations. And what we start to get are these sort of larger gaps in our fabric of well-being, or holes in our well-being. And essentially, I suppose in this talk, in looking at matching people's occupational identity to community opportunities, what we're trying to do is either not have those gaps appear in the first place, or plug those gaps when they do appear, so that people can continue to feel like themselves. And the way in which we do that really is when we're meeting somebody, well, somebody at all, but certainly for this case, when we're meeting somebody with dementia, what we're looking at is trying to discover their life history. We're looking at, very often we might complete a role in a leisure activity checklist to see the kind of things that they're interested in. maybe looking at their routine daily activities and sort of observing someone actually carrying it out, because that helps us understand the motivation for it. Remembering that one person's occupation is another person's task. This was actually something that was said at one of your conferences, Sinead, a good few years back, and it always stuck with me. And it makes me think, I have a cousin, and she adores cleaning, like absolutely adores it. And so for her, the activity of cleaning is an occupation. It's a really valued occupation. And I think about all those people who follow Mrs. Hinch, all whatever 3 million of them. And perhaps they're all people who really value that as an occupation. Whereas for somebody else, I say me, it's considered a task. So the only upside that I can see of the current levels of restrictions is that actually nobody's in your house. So that level of cleaning doesn't have to quite keep up to scratch. Because for me, it's a task, but for someone else, it's an occupation. And yet it's the same activity on paper. So somebody's motivation for doing it is really, really important. Gaining collateral from family members, obviously really key, and then observing for the small details. So I'll just bring you on to talk about John. So what we have here, I suppose, is some of the bits that make up his occupational identity, not everything, but just some in order to sort of illustrate it today. So when we think about John, he's got a couple of roles there, and he also has a couple of things that he's interested in. So again, sort of on paper or on the surface, if we think, okay, well, John likes to go for a walk. So maybe, you know, you might be thinking, well, we might link him in with a local walking group, or maybe the Alzheimer's Society meet once a week and they go for a walk, and that might be something that would be really good for him. But actually, when we understand John's motivation for walking and the type of man that he is and his life history, we understand that making small talk on a walk or talking to people who he doesn't know very well would just really drive him bananas. So actually, walking is something that he wants to do by himself because he likes the physical activity of it as opposed to the social aspect of it. But his family are a bit concerned around that. So now we've got to sort of mitigate potential risk and have a look at things like, well, maybe there's a predetermined route, and maybe there's some technology that can help him to continue to express that part of his occupational identity and the fact that he enjoys that. And so the same with gardening. Again, on paper, we might think, okay, yeah, well, maybe there's a gardening group, or maybe there's something to do with the garden that John would really like to do that we could involve him in the community. But again, if we go back to maybe looking at the motivation for it, we discover that actually it was his wife who always loved the garden as such, and gardening and the bulbs and flowers and, you know, all that interest. What John was really good at was keeping the front really tidy, and then that curb that comes out onto the front where he's living in a suburban area, really tidy. And very often he was known to kind of pop next door because the neighbours didn't quite have theirs to the standard that he did. So he might do their curb as well. And so the gardening wasn't really about the love of gardening. When you really understood his motivation for it, the gardening was about keeping things tidy and that kind of civic responsibility almost for kind of a nice neighborhood. And so actually then, well, something like that could be a good community opportunity for John then is something like a men's shed, or something like our local daughter action group, where, you know, once a month you might go. Are you on to tell me to hurry up, Sinead?
Very gently.
Okay. So once a month you might go and you know, do something that's kind of bigger for the community as such. So I won't go through each of these in those great details, but I suppose the matching the community opportunity, it's really about understanding the motivation for why someone's doing the occupation in the first place. And then the other piece, I suppose, that really for me with John is that actually sometimes, and we talked about that earlier, those small details. He has a pen in his breast pocket and Irish Times under his arm. And that essentially is his expression of occupational identity. Like in that, he is saying, I'm still me, and it's really important. So it involves a strong knowledge of the local community, services available, both dementia or non-dementia, just, you know, any of the services that are available in the community. But really key is knowing the motivation behind the occupation, and that's part of someone's occupational identity. And actually what we find, and most of you will know this who are watching or listening, is that usually it's just a really few good people in the community who you know to ring to say, look, I have a gentleman we've met, this is the kind of thing he'd be interested in, is there some way we can match him up? So in summary, you'll be delighted, Sinead, we now all know and have experienced what restrictions placed on our chosen occupations feel like, and how that actually has impacted on our well-being. but we also understand what it is like to be in something together. And I know Colin Henry talked a lot about that sense of mehel and that collective response. And I think equally, when we're talking about community opportunities, we understand that the community isn't somebody else. We are the actual community. Each person makes up this large place within the community that can support people. So I don't know how to pronounce his name, I think it's Charlie Mackesy, but his drawings are wonderful. And I suppose I wanted to finish on that because I think, you know, there's going to come a time where, when we think about it from a COVID perspective, some of these restrictions are hopefully going to decrease again. And, you know, we're going to be back on the golf course, or back getting our hair done, or back doing yoga, and be delighted that actually we're back doing art shows and occupation. And I think it's really, really important for us to not leave people with dementia and their care partners behind as we kind of rush to sort of go ahead with life with our reduced restrictions, but actually know that people with dementia may still have some restrictions on them, and there may be lots of things that we can do to lower those restrictions and allow people to continue with their own occupations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that very timely look at occupational identity, and for us all to consider it, as well as for those for whom people are caring. So thank you so much. So I'll introduce Frances Maloney. Frances is Operations Manager with Community Action on Dementia, Mayo. And Frances is going to talk about music, song and dance meets dementia.
Thank you, Sinead, and I promise not to keep you too long. I think we've done a lot of listening and reading for the afternoon, so I'm going to reverse my presentation format, and I'm going to start at the end, which is what I'm going to talk about, and that is our dance memory clubs here in County Mayo. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy the slides that show you, I suppose, how we bring our three groups together a couple of times a year. And I suppose the body language, the facial expressions and the quotes alongside some of the photos will speak for themselves. So I'm just going to share this now, and I hope you enjoy it.
I am not a stranger to the dark. Hide away, they say, 'cause we don't want your broken parts. I learned to be ashamed of all my scars. Run away, they say, no one will love you as you are. But I won't let them break me down to dust. I know that there's a place for us, for we are glorious. When the sharpest words wanna cut me down, I'm gonna send the blood, gonna drown them out. I am brave, I am bruised, I am who I'm meant to be. This is me. Look out, 'cause here I come, and I'm marching on to the beat I drum. I'm not scared to be seen, I make no apologies. This is me. Through the gonna send a flood, gonna drown a man. This is brave, this is bruised, this is who I'm meant to be. This is me. Look out, 'cause here I come. And I'm marching out to the beat I drum. To help me, I'm not scared. To be seen, I make no apologies. This is me. Whenever the words wanna cut me down, I send the thought to drown out. This is me.
So I hope you enjoyed that. So as Sinead says, I facilitate 2 out of the 3 dementia memory clubs in County Mayo. And I'm just going to talk you through what they are and how we set them up and why we set them up. So basically, it's a weekly 2-hour social support for the person with dementia and their +1. And by that, I mean, it can be husband, wife, neighbour, friend, or a paid carer. It's designed for those living with dementia and their +1s to share the experience together, because oftentimes they become the cared for as opposed to the husband and wife. So we try to instill that couplehood through the clubs. The dance clubs offers a great opportunity to socialise and to obviously promote mental and physical well-being, but the most important aspect and ethos of the clubs is to have fun. It's a confidential space where like-minded people can come together, as I said, to dance, to chat, to sing, to share stories, and to drink tea, more importantly. It's supported by our dementia friend volunteers and community groups, and this is very important because the dance memory clubs were never part of our original plan. So our dementia friends support us as facilitators, and the community groups helps in the financial side of things in terms of fundraising. We don't charge for the service. The first one that we set up was in Claremorris, and I approached the Claremorris Lions Club and I made them aware that the service had started in the town, and they rolled in behind it, and they now run an annual table quiz to raise the funds to pay for the room rental, the teas and the biscuits, and they oftentimes throw in hampers for little raffles for the milestones throughout the years, like Christmas, Valentine's and St. Patrick's Day. The other 2 clubs then are based in Ballina and Westport. So why were they established? Well, the long story short is that they were based on need. An additional service that Community Action on Dementia provides is our one-to-one individualised support service. But it's budget dependent, and the list was getting longer. So I sat down and did a desk study of where there were clusters of referrals, and based on this I targeted areas, and that's why we have a spread of the 3 towns of Claremorris in the south, Ballina in the northwest, and Westport in the west of the county. And we spoke to those on the waiting list to see if they'd be willing to engage in a weekly support service, and the feedback was very positive. So we filled in a short little referral form, just focusing on the individual's likes and dislikes in terms of music, and we got them to think about what their favourite music was, you know, what songs evoked memory, and, you know, things that we could use on days that maybe they might be feeling a little bit blue, that we'd noticed on a song that I liked or Tom liked or whoever liked, so that we could pull them back into the room and reconnect them with the environment around them. We also did a snapshot of the person. I've heard a lot about social biographies of the person, and that's a hugely important piece of work because it gives you such a clear insight into the person before they step into the room, and it also gives you clear direction on how to engage with them, and I suppose to get to know them at a level that is comfortable for them. So referrals come from our Dementia Advisor Service here in County Mayo, our public health nurse, GPs, other healthcare professionals, OTs, Cycle Later Life, and sometimes family members who are living far away. You know, they might be doing the research for the family in terms of what's out there and what they can access. So the science behind it, I mean, it was spoken about earlier, you know, how do you evaluate some of these psychosocial models? Research has already, I suppose, delivered verification that music evokes motions that brings memory, and that's something, I suppose, that conjures up memories of old for the person with dementia, and that musical aptitude and appreciation are two of the last remaining abilities in a person living with dementia. And it's just wonderful to think that music can reach places within the person's psyche that we can't as individuals. And I think this is a lovely factor, that music can bring emotional and physical closeness. Again, due to the caring role and the cared for role, you know, sometimes couples no longer kind of share couple things or stuff, and when they dance, it can lead to hugs and kisses and just natural reflexes that may be overlooked from time to time. And of course, singing is engaging. You know, it activates the left side of the brain, and music, you know, activates the right. So the brain is stimulated to a lovely level, and it's known that patients seem to be exercising more power than usual. And when I describe the dance groups to people in terms of, you know, what is it, I call it exercise for the brain, and the importance of that is maintaining the person at the level they're at for as long as possible. And of course, music can shift mood and manage stress. Singing doesn't require cognitive function that is present in most dementia patients. And this reminds me of one particular gentleman that was referred by a senior occupational therapist who had progressive aphasia, and who had been, you know, done very well in his career, and, you know, had managed a large company and organization at a multinational level. And then, you know, he was struggling to get words out. And when I encouraged him to sing and to find a tune that he was familiar with, it gave him great solace, and it was a lovely thing to witness. In terms of, you know, the setup and what does it look like on the ground, we keep it very simple. A 2-hour session, and myself and the volunteers meet half an hour before our clients come in. We set the place up in the same format every week, you know, in a cafe-like style. They come in, we'll welcome them. I go table to table, I write out all the name badges. I tell them I have to tag them because I can't keep track of them, and they think this is hilarious. But it allows me to chat individually with people to see how their week has been, to see if anything has been going on, or if anyone needs support in other ways in terms of their dementia. And all 3 of our groups have an anthem. It's a Beautiful Sunday by Daniel Boom, and we do this seated, although some do stand, but it's basically, we have our own little movements from the upper body up in terms of moving everybody, and just signaling to people that this is the start of the formal session. We also use the time to update people on any new information that might be relevant to carers in terms of pendant alarm schemes, training, any updates on budget issues, or to answer any questions or concerns they might have about, you know, housing adaptation schemes. And we also use the time to send messages back to the groups from those that might have been missing for health reasons. The other thing we always impress upon those attending is that everyone's welcome within their family. So oftentimes people will come home from America to visit during the summer, and we invite them in so that they can see their brother or their sister belongs and has somewhere to go every week, where he can connect with people that appreciate him for where he's at on that day, without any judgment. And we just like to have a bit of fun and keep it very simple. So the positive outcomes, you know, for all is that it breaks down barriers, particularly for family carers, because it makes it easier for them to ask for help. The dance memory clubs are really a light touch support, like nearly the first step on the ladder to a lot of supports. So we see ourselves as a gateway. It supports the weekly routine. It's an opportunity to meet new friends and also to reconnect with old friends, because we've seen this happen time and time again, where we'd introduce a new couple, and the next thing they knew, Tom and Susan from years ago, where they used to share family holidays when their children were young. It helps reduce stigma in the communities, because all 3 of our groups are very, very visible in the towns that they're in, and they're known, and they're in very visible places within the family resource centres and in a local hotel in Westport. it's a natural support network for each other. I know that they're texting each other and calling each other outside of the weekly sessions. So that has built up a lovely natural support network for them all. And it pushes the boundaries. You know, I don't sing, I don't dance. One gentleman had never danced in his life, and I didn't know this. And I approached him one day and I said, "Do you want to come out and dance, Aidan?" And he said, "Sure, why not?" And his wife nearly fell off the chair because in all the years she'd known him, he'd never danced. So yeah, so from that point of view, it's fun as well. And it gives a safe space to meet every week without judgment, with the professional support available. And most importantly, it gives family carers and those living with dementia a sense of connection, that they're not in isolation. Mayo is a very rural county, so to come into these groups weekly, it really gives them a sense of being and belonging. And I've heard a lot of talk today about COVID-19, and it did prove a challenge, but we have migrated our 3 clubs over to Zoom at the same time each week. It wasn't for everybody, but I went, you know, house to house, phoning people, helping them to install Zoom, and then setting up one-to-ones to make sure they were comfortable using it. So tomorrow morning, I'll be getting texts, you know, where's the invite? You know, why aren't you on? Is it on? So it's still a persistent bit of pressure from those availing of it, COVID or no COVID, and it has really given people an out when they couldn't leave the house. And again, that sense of connectedness and support within our dementia community here in County Mayo. Never miss a chance to dance. It's a great way to meet people. It's a great way to remain visible, and it's a great way to live with dementia within your community. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful way to end our 2-day conference. So apologies, Catherine and Esme, I won't chair a big discussion because we've kind of run over time a little bit. I think calling it a light touch support kind of undersells it a little, to be honest. There's huge depth there, and the song was absolutely wonderful as well. I don't know about other people, but certainly it's so full of joy. It resonated with the moments of joy that you commented on earlier, Esme, and I'm sure occupational identity too, Catherine. Before I just say a few very final words, if there is anything you'd like to say, Esme or Catherine, in response to that before we finish up, feel free. What do you think? Music and dance connection, human connection, is this what it's about?
Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, even just listening to that and watching it, France, I kind of had a lump in my throat. I don't know whether it's because of the Greatest Showman or that song, but, you know, or maybe just the times we're living in, because it does feel like we've lost some of that at the moment, you know, when you see so many of those images. But we'll get back to that. And I think, you know, people are just adapting as much as they can at the moment. And, you know, you can still find joy over Zoom. And certainly this, you know, 2 days of this conference has shown people that you can do that. You know, we can still interact. It's just different. But that's part of us adapting and part of us being resilient. And, you know, we're asking people with dementia to be that every day. So certainly for music, I know, like, I was redeployed at one point into a nursing home during the pandemic. And I know one of the gentlemen, like, we didn't know the residents particularly well. So, you know, you were kind of landed in, we were all PPE'd up. It was all, you know, very strange for everybody involved. But there was a gentleman who we were trying to help get going in the morning, and over his bed, you know, I mean, I knew whether he needed a hoist or he didn't, or whether he was going to, you know, he was at risk of fall. But I was like, oh, I just really need to know his favorite song. If I knew his favorite song, actually, we'd all just get along an awful lot better, because he couldn't communicate that much to me. And I've been back to that occupation. I was kind of madly looking around the room trying to find clues, you know, and trying to look at, does he have any tapes or any records anywhere? Because if I just had a song, I know if I start humming that, we'll get a lot further. So absolutely, the power of music and memory is phenomenal, and also just the way it connects people. So yeah, terrific, and lovely way to finish it, Frances. Well done. My
final word is I was actually enthralled with Catherine's identity wheel, and I was asking myself, I brought back my own memories of being brought up and going to dances, and in Kenya, these were Goan dances. And then I went to Ireland and got to know loads of people because I used to ceilidh in the pub. And I worked in Ireland for 2 years. I then married, came back to England, and I married a husband who doesn't like dancing. So I loved Francis's example, and I hope we don't have to wait till one or other of us develop our dementia before we get dancing again.
Well, Esme, we will have you over to Ireland as soon as the COVID is settled. This conference had to go virtual this year, but we will totally get together when this is passed and when we have come through this. And as you said, Catherine.
But Francis's example starting off showed us exactly what I meant by measuring in the moment. And I believe the evaluation of emotion well-being can be done via Zoom, and I've seen it happen. I can't do it, but people with dementia can, and they actually can take snapshots of Zoom sessions talking to each other and send them out to each other. So, you know, these ways of demonstrating that some of these almost kind of run on a shoestring and fundraising kind of events can be measurable and may well be the way forward in the future. So.
Okay, so thank you so much to Esme, Catherine and Francis. And also thank you. So it's the end of our 2 days of plenary and parallel sessions. I'd like to just say thank you to Professor Kate Irving, our academic partner from Dublin City University, our advisory panel, Global Brain Health Institute, National Dementia Office, DSIDC, the Alzheimer's Society and Nursing Homes Ireland, our team in the background who have made this happen, Grace, Niamh and Shri, and Kim will be taking over from me this week too. So Kim has been very much working on this too. So together, so it's very much a team effort. So thank you to the team. And then tomorrow, the Dementia Research Network of Ireland, actually also on our advisory panel, and the National Dementia Office are co-hosting a policy and practice forum on dementia post-diagnostics supports, a changing landscape, which is a really nice way to wrap up the conference. So if there are people who'd like to go who haven't registered yet, just go to our website and you can register there. And finally, I'll say that Engaging Dementia has been shortlisted for a Charity Impact Award. So do feel free to consider voting for us. If you go to our website, you can do that there. So consider voting for us and sharing the word. Actually, I'll launch just a very brief poll here too for people, just to give us an idea of people, you know, how much they enjoyed this or otherwise. And yeah, I'll finish there. So thank you so much, Esme, Catherine and Francis, and to people who stayed with us a little late, but it was totally worth it in my opinion.